Most procurement leaders don't lose time in the big strategic stuff. They lose it in the messy middle. Acknowledgements, promise dates, pricing mismatches, follow ups, and exceptions that turn your inbox into the system of record. Today's episode is about procurement systems that actually stick. Not the demo, not the roadmap, but the reality. How a supply chain leader evaluates tools, gets adoption, and prevents the process from decaying back into the chaos. Welcome back to the Leverage Supply Chains. I'm Andrew Stroup, your host. Steve Andrews is joining me and is a supply chain and procurement leader who's lived the hard parts, buying decisions, implementation, change management, and operating inside real world constraints. Steve, welcome to the show. For listeners who don't know your background, what kinds of problems have you consistently been pulled into as a supply chain leader?
Well, thanks for having me on, Andrew. Nice to be here. I've spanned a couple of different fields within supply chains, starting with the broadest strategic sourcing, either for mergers and acquisitions or private equity. The second thread was actually doing system implementations for e-sourcing and contract lifecycle management systems that bolted up to ERPs. And then most recently, interim director of supply chain for a private equity owned company trying to automate the supply chain so that it can scale for the growth projections that they had upon acquisition.
Got it. Well, I guess with that and kind of the through line across all those roles, what are some of the failure modes that you've seen or keep seeing? I think almost in the framing of like, I've seen this movie before, signal you notice early.
So I think the biggest thing is everybody now wants to rush to agile. Let's do it as quick as possible. And I think they forget sometimes the detail within supply chain. Two biggest mistakes I see is that the strategy is not translated into how are the buyer's actions going to change tomorrow as a result of implementing the strategy. And then two, thinking through master data governance. At the end of the day, it's important that your master data gets back into your ERP system of record and that it stays clean. So through all this, it can't get a lot of noise or bad data introduced into the system. And if you take those two things into account, your success rate goes up substantially. Or if you try to shortcut either one of those, you'll wind up with a system that's live, but no one's using it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's probably what we've always seen is like the worst fear, right? Is that you go through all this process, you do all the hard work and then it doesn't get there. And I think it's not a single thing, but kind of a momentum building and a lot of different pieces, which is obviously why we're chatting. But, even before we get into the tech and those pieces, like what's your working definition of a procurement system that does stick? I mean, is it sticking, 6 months after go live? Is it the failure mode testing and symptoms that you're tracking? Would love to hear how you frame that up.
I think for procurement specifically, right? What's important is that your buyer's team is actually logging into the system or getting the outputs of the system on a daily basis. Within 6 months or 9 months, the metrics that I would look for is, is the data being used? What number of my purchase orders are being impacted by the system? What percent of spend is being impacted by the system? And is it effective, right? Do we trust the data or is everybody questioning what comes out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the classic data junk in, data junk out model, and ultimately, it's that rep cycles of those users practicing and getting comfortable in a new mode of operandum, if you will. And I think that's actually a good transition because talking through why most procurement workflows quietly collapse back into email, spreadsheets, tribal knowledge, the old way of doing things. In your experience, why do procurement systems fail after launch? I mean, even when the intent is good.
I think the two biggest things, one I mentioned earlier, right? The strategy was never translated into day-to-day activities. So we had this great PowerPoint deck, great sales deck. The executive saw this wonderful dashboard, but didn't realize what it took to get the dashboard to work in the real world in their company, right? Data cleanups are required. But the second biggest thing is, excuse me, the second biggest thing is not having an owner that's in the buyer's group. So as a director, I could own it for so long. But if I don't have anybody actually owning it day to day, that's where it's going to fail. Like on the implementation that you did at one of the portfolio companies I worked at, I drove that for the first 6 months really hard, but I did not drive that for the last year. The team owned that. The buyer's team owned the weekly calls and the troubleshooting. And that's important, right? They have to own it so that they don't just give up and let the foot off the gas. And to your point, go back to emails and doing it offline, right? If they own it, then that system has success and sticking. after the implementation's over.
Absolutely. Well, and that was actually one of my follow-up questions was, what is that thing? And it definitely seems like process ownership is a huge aspect of that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what's the like most common we didn't think about this edge case that you have seen or you did
So I think the two areas that pop up the most is not underestimating the end user's willingness and creativeness to circumvent the system. It always impresses me how hard people will work to not use the system, right? And I think one of the there's a little meme out there that has like a sidewalk, it looks like on a college campus of intended usage and the little footpath through the grass of actual usage, and you need to account for that, right? So, and how do you do that? Well, one, I think it's making sure that you've mapped through all of the processes and you have all of the different use cases mapped out. Now, I'm not saying that the system has to handle every single use case, but you have to identify we're gonna take these 80% of the use cases are in the system. Now, 10% on this side and 10% on this side, they're going to be offline because it's R&D, it's some really offline kind of thing that we don't want to automate in the tool. But at the end of the day, how do the results of that offline work get back into your ERP system? If you've accounted for that, I think, that works well. You mentioned emails earlier, and especially on contract lifecycle management systems, I can't tell you the number of times where I've tried to tell a client, you don't want emails for everything. Log into the system, look at the dashboard. Look, no, 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 I want an email. So, we put the email in. Within 3 weeks of go live, I get the frantic call like, please make the email stop. I don't want any more emails, right? So those are probably the two biggest areas where people are surprised if you've not been through this, a number of times before.
Well, that's actually a great segue because, I know we were talking about the tactical users, but what's the inverse of that, the hidden tax and procurement that executives underestimate? Is it the actual go live? How does the time distribute between like, buyers, expediters, AP receiving? Like, what's the operational cost of not knowing all that context? I think that's always an interesting flip side of that.
Well, if you allow for a failed implementation, right? I break out the costs and, what's my cost for the provider, for the software, for the implementation team? What's the internal cost of the resources that are working on it? To me, though, those are the tip of the iceberg because as soon as you have a failed system implementation, you've done two really bad things that will last for years after. One is you've lost a lot of credibility of procurement systems and what they can do. Two is you've just enabled all those creative people I just talked about that like to circumvent systems. You've just given them a clear pass to stay in the rut that they're in. So it's really important when you're first looking at putting systems in, even if I want to do this much work up front, right? Start with something small and meaningful that's impactful. Get successes on that, prove that it works, and then build from there. I would rather do 6 small successful implementations than try to do one big bang and have it fail at the end of the day. The other part of that is just to your point about executives, right? Executives have a responsibility because even though you've empowered the local team, buyers are having problems with AP or they're having problems with IT. You have to have an escalation mechanism where they can go above each individual organizational silo and have somebody at the executive level that's listening to it and make rational choices of what needs to get changed or what needs to get implemented and resolve conflicts at the business unit level, right? So if you have a steer code and executive, communication and decision making matrix, you empower that team to raise issues they can't solve on their own and and
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that leads into like more the tactical piece of it, right? Where when you think about the messy middle, if you will, with the day to day of the buyers, with acknowledgements and promise dates and pricing, mismatches, exceptions, it's almost like a leadership problem in some ways because it's not just a systems problem. You're thinking about cultural change and what that means for chasing all the time and supply relationships. It is as you transition into from the systems to the tactic. It sounds like you guys have to really think through what that means for you as the impact on the day-to-day basis, right?
the other thing that I think that large companies do better because they have organizations that are responsible for this that small and medium companies struggle with is master data governance. One of the biggest things I fight at medium-sized portfolio companies is each individual function has been able to build systems on their own in a vacuum. And now we're trying to scale them up. so that consistent master data governance, only having one source of truth that flows through, it's clean and it's maintained clean. The other thing that, when I was working at a large global pharmaceutical company, at the end of the day, across the globe, there were only 5 people, one on each continent, that could approve a new item master for them. Now, compare that to most small companies I go to. There's literally like 60 people in the organization that can create one because their mindset is, oh, well, if we can't create this, we can't get the order out, we can't serve the customer. So when I tell them, no, you need to have less people, they absolutely fight that paradigm. And it's not until you look at how many duplicate item masters do we have? Or you're dealing with, well, the wrong part came in because it looked the same and this was the obsolete one and, whatever. And then you get some buy-in to be like, well, hey, we have duplicates. The data's not right. Or what also we found on a financial system is I have an orange push button and I want to get a green one. Well, if I'm lazy and I copy the wrong thing, it might be the item master might be assigned to the wrong GL code. So even though the right part came into supply chain, finance is having a fit because this thing is showing up in the wrong cost center, right? So I think
Mm.
it's that discipline of both the resources as well as master data governance, that because once the master data is wrong, now you start questioning what's coming out of the system.
Absolutely. Yeah. Back obviously to the, data in, data out, junk in, junk out model we were just talking about. But it is very true. It's interesting to think about the failure modes. And obviously the question that comes up is how do you evaluate the solution so you don't repeat that cycle? I always am curious on the buying playbook, if you will. Like when you're evaluating procurement or supply chain automation, what are your actual non-negotiables when you do the kind of down select review of the RFP?
Well, let's talk about selection of the leverage application, right? I mean that's a prime one. I reached out to 4 different providers that doing research looked like they could do it. 3 of the 4 wanted me to implement their whole procure to pay system. No, I really just want a point solution, right? I'm not going to get approval for doing a whole new procure to pay. So that's part of it. The other one is looking for trying to sift through what I call the snake oil salesman. If I'm talking with a software provider and they keep assuring me that their system can do everything and do it really well, right? That's a number one red flag, right? Be honest with me of what does your system do? What does your system not do? I've been around procurement long enough to know that no one system is good at every single facet of supply chain. So be honest with me of where you fit, right? Make sure it can solve the point solution. The biggest thing to me and where leverage was excellent is following through on what you say. Like if you say you're going to do this, are you actually going to make that enhancement or make that fix? Are you going to do it in the timeline? One of the projects I had was I came in to be the IT program manager for an oil and gas company in the Middle East. I went there to do e-sourcing and CLM. I was promoted up to the IT program manager, and I actually wound up re-selecting 8 of the 18 projects that we had to different providers because the providers that were picked did not follow through on anything that they said, right? And the thing that I really liked about the leverage team is like, if you say you're going to do something by Tuesday, then by God, by Tuesday it was there, and we worked through issues. So that's it. Looking at people that are watching this and saying, "Well, how do I know?" Like, if you're through the buying cycle is like dating, right? Everybody's on their best possible behavior. If you're not getting good feedback and good responses during the buying cycle, you are not going to like the implementation team once you've signed the contract, right? So just cut to the chase, quickly. So the thing that I liked about working with you and your team is you guys were honest. We can do this, we can't do that. Right. Because when I asked you back then, this is years ago, right? Hey, can you do three-way match? You're like, no, man, we don't have three-way match yet. It's something we're working on. And I truly appreciated that versus you being the sales guy and be like, oh yeah, I can do three-way match. And you're building it in the background and I'm the guinea pig of it. Right. So I really did appreciate that.
Absolutely. I definitely agree. Especially, I think people underestimate how, real manufacturing distributors, how critical mission systems are to mission processes, right? And it's like, you can't just get 98% of the way there. You have to get 100% of the way there. but also it is you become a partner and extension of the core operations, right? And
Oh
so,
yeah.
similar to like the dating side of it, I always think about like what are the deal breakers? Like the things that look fine in a demo but maybe fail in production. I think about for you, it's like what's that demo trap you've learned to avoid, or what questions do you ask the vendors that you've evaluated, but that they hate to hear those questions, but the operators inherently always need to really ask it, even if it's an uncomfortable question.
I typically like to have access to a sandbox. Anybody that's smart can pull off a great demo, right? You can have people doing stuff in the background. You've staged the data that it works. So I always like to try to do like some kind of sandbox or give them a trial. Like, hey, here's a partial export of my PO file or whatever it is, right? Like you process this, let me see what it looks like. And then let me evaluate because and anybody can do a great demo, right? It's part of it, but I don't fully trust it, right? Because in the demo, you don't know like what actually works, what they've configured in the background, or what it's going to flow through. Um, and also just be reasonable of expectations. I mean, AI does a lot, right? But for purchasing, for POs, I think there's a fine line of like how leverage uses AI to figure things out and automate them. Part of it might be my age, but I don't trust AI to tell me which vendor to go select yet at all, right? I want it to summarize the data and let me look at it, but I want to look at it and read it. Now that's different than, hey, I ordered a box and for this supplier, that box equals 24, or for another vendor, it equals something different. I mean, that's a good use of AI and automating the tool. But when you're watching a demo and it's telling you like, oh, well, you can reduce headcount by this because the system's going to make these decisions for you. That makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, to be honest with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually talking to someone else, I think on a prior podcast. And it's interesting because I think people misunderstand some of the impact that we've at least observed by being in the trenches of where AI is impactful. And it really is where we've seen often is AI being very impactful for reducing the friction of getting things to the user,
Mhm.
to the people in supply chain and the seats, but we can't displace the decision. And even
Right.
most of the time, the recommendations are usually wrong because you have so much context and tribal knowledge. But it's about accelerating what we always call like the space mountain ride. We're trying to help you guys get to that space mountain ride as often and frequently as possible. But we care about the line up front that takes 3 hours to get to reduce that. I in the category of AI and, sometimes snake oil, but ultimately ROI, I think I'm always curious about how have you structured that narrative internally? Like when you think about, okay, I'm gonna pick this solution, I'm gonna launch it. And there's obviously like narratives and some fluff, but how have you structured that, whether it's headcount avoidance, cycle time, error reduction, service level, margin leakage? I'm just thinking through how you frame that because it's obviously very impactful to get buy-in, right?
Yeah. The easiest way, obviously, is with hard savings, right? What does the system cost versus what is the alternative? Like, so when we had selected leverage, I was literally looking at adding 2 to 3 additional headcount. So that was a real hard savings number, right? So that is what actually got private equity to agree to it. Like, okay, we can spend this amount of money on this tool, or I can go hire 3 people. And what they literally were doing was opening, we issued, excuse me, hundreds of purchase orders a week. I mean, literally hundreds every single week, which meant we had to process hundreds of PO acknowledgements every week. Not only is that a lot of labor hours, but it's really tedious. Like, who wants to come in and process purchase order acknowledgements like on a weekly basis, right? So, leading over to the soft cost of the soft cost of the equation was the buyer's team was infinitely more happy with their work life, the balance, right? What they were doing at work because they felt they were doing less monotonous tasks and they were able to go into the leverage dashboard and say, oh, well, I don't have order acknowledgements for these, or I have pricing discrepancies on this. And it wasn't them just doing the manual keying, right? So, first of all, is hard savings. Then, secondly, is all the kind of soft costs, which is, how happy is the team? What's the turnover rate? What's my likelihood of, because I was smart enough to know I'm going to have a really hard time going to hire 3 people telling them, yeah, you're gonna key in purchase order acknowledgments all day, every day, right? I mean, who wants to do that, right? So that's kind of how I look at it. For a lot of the supply chains, so if we were talking strategic sourcing, right? Now we get into a lot of that margin erosion, things like that. The spot focus for me was, do I trust that this system is going to work and do all the purchase orders? And to your point, it's important that leverage processes POs every single day, because if we don't, we can't deliver the product to our utility customers. And in a lot of the cases, that really matters because we have liquidated damages. So if we don't deliver a system on
Mm,
time because we didn't get the parts in, that can cost us thousands of dollars a day.
absolutely. That makes total sense too, because I think building on some of the topics we've been talking already, AI, people are like, oh, great. AI is just going to hand wave and solve all of your problems. And that's not the reality. I think what the reality is, back to what we've seen and even working with you, is that it's about deepening the value of very specific workflows that drive very specific, tangible, trackable metrics that we can go back to, which I think is key. It's interesting too, because you've had so many different adventures when it comes to professional adventures, when it comes to, whether it's living through integrations, change management, M&A environments, private equity. What have you seen get harder with like that parent company governance? And then also like, just how do you keep momentum without breaking all the controls? You definitely have found a sweet spot in tackling.
The polite People have described me in a polite way as persistent. You can use other adjectives, but you have to be able to make a use case, right? Now, the great thing that I tend to have is I have a long track record of successes, right? That I can point to at previous companies. So that helps, right? Because, and then if you pick a good partner like you, like my credibility within the private equity firm and the company that put this in at went way up when leverage worked as well as it did. A lot of people were doubtful, but I was persistent and convincing enough to get him to sign up. Because and what leverage did really well in that equation as well was, you did things that my IT team did not want to do. My team did not want to build APIs to all these different software, like all these different softwares that the suppliers use, right? So I'm like, no, we have to do one API to leverage. Leverage will handle all the rest of it. And they're like, what? So I think, being able to articulate what the value is, what's the alternative? If we don't do that, like, you want to grow X this much per year. Well, you have to add this many resources. We're not going to be happy. We put the system in, and we started small, right? So our first workflow was pretty easy. We didn't even have an API, right? It was this horrible secure FTP file exchange. And then we got them comfortable with that. And then we was like, okay, now, we haven't, had any issues. There's no IT issues. They have way better IT security than we do. Let's do the API route, right? And because you handled all the APIs with all the suppliers they didn't want to do, your firm's really good at supplier communication, right? Well, when we sit down with a new onboard supplier, you have the training and all the stuff that we don't really have time to do or aren't good at doing. So that was kind of like that fit. So being able to do that and push it through, and for people watching this that have been with the same company for a long time, like I said, start small, get a success, and then grow that success from there. Right. Because, now, we've added some really substantial workflows to the leverage implementation with pricing and how does it update, and, building off of that success. And I think it's opened the door to look at even more things, that we could do, like three-way matches or stuff like that. Right. So, I mean, that's kind of the way I approach it. I know it probably doesn't work for everybody that might be watching this, but small wins, being able to articulate the value and what's the alternative. Well, if I do nothing, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it actually is also a great transition, because getting the separation between good intentions and real outcomes, right? Like this, I think it's really impactful, especially for the listeners, to hear about the implementation and the implementation reality and the staying power and how we think about adoption. From your perspective, what does a good implementation actually look like from how you've tackled this in the past? And I think about that when it comes to, process and day to day roles, about maintaining and ensuring it doesn't go off the rails. Would love to hear your thoughts on that strategy.
Well, even with the best strategy and the best team, right? Let's just realize there's going to be days the implementation is messy. So be prepared, prepare your team for that, right? I mean, when we started on this, I talked to the team like, listen, we're going to have to work through a lot of item master conversions. We order it in eaches. It comes from the supplier in boxes or cases. We order it in linear feet. They sell it in sheets. So be prepared for that. Be prepared to work through the errors, right? When we get errors, that's why and you start small, right? Don't start with 50 suppliers out the gate. Our first run was 5, right? And it was the 5 we were the most strategic with. And it's the 5, and the way that I told them, like, listen, we want to go with the 5 suppliers that have the largest number of purchase orders. It's in both of our best interests to make this work, right? And what we try to do is like carrot and a stick, right? The carrot was, hey, if we get this improvement, and remember, we opened it up to them, like you can pick a multitude of different ways that you want to send the data to leverage. So y'all talk amongst yourselves and pick. So with your application, we gave them choices. The stick was, look, after I implement this, a year from now, we're going to push volume to the suppliers that are on this system, right? So if out of the 5 of you, only 3 of you want to do this, well, all my purchases are going to go to the 3 that are on the system because I don't want to have to manually process that many PO acknowledgements, right? So, and then we were lucky that we had suppliers that were also willing to work with us. And I think the way to structure that is we had the 3-year long-term agreement. It was a partnership. And we're like, listen, invest up front. Let's make this work. And then, we opened it up for them to also, look at, and I think we're doing it with looking at like, bidirectional transmission, right? So we weren't just the only one getting the data. I'm like, hey, if you want to, we're sending the data to leverage. If you want leverage to send you the data instead of your team keying it in, let's open it up and let you do it. And, that's the way I structured it for this one, specifically. Slightly different aside on the e-sourcing tool and contract lifecycle management, though, you have to decide what are you going to do in the system? What's your global core? What are some of the localizations that you want to do? And be willing to say, if you want to use this tool, these are the rules you have to abide by. We're not just going to let anything in here, right? Not every one-off crazy process. Like if you want to use this tool, this is what it supports. And by the way, if it doesn't go in the tool, it's because the business process you're trying to automate is not a sound business process.
That's actually a great commentary because I think something I always try to open up with, even with net new customers now, is that we're going to go through all this process. I personally believe that Leverage is an exceptional platform and tool. However, it does bring the questions of, is the current process something you want to maintain or do we want to change it? And I think that's a very important aspect, which you highlight around. You have to define that scope and box. And it's not always obvious and it's always not, there's a little pain sometimes. So part of the
Oh
journey
yeah.
with that. Thinking about the audience, right? If you did have to give a peer, like do this, not that checklist from like procurement automation in today, like 2025, what do you think's on it? Are you thinking about like how they're picking a tool, what they should or should not delegate? How do they measure success? Would love to hear your framework.
I mean, picking a tool is obviously important. So there's, depending on the company, right? So the company that I was at had very specific business processes because of how they built stuff for the utility. So we needed to find a tool that was more flexible than if I were like a typical manufacturing company. Right. But I think it's be open to the fact that you need to use this implementation as a way to review and refine your current business process because most of them probably aren't best in class. I mean, they've grown over time. You've gotten into a rut of doing them. But if you really want to scale and leverage a system, you're probably going to have to adjust your business process. So it's a trifecta of working with IT for the IT solution master data, working with a solution provider. Where do I want to spend development money for you to go fix something or make something different? And where do I adjust my business process to better fit what the system and automation can do? And if you do those 3 things, you'll be successful. And it's kind of a balancing act. There's not a prescription. It's work in conjunction across those 3, areas.
I love that. Okay. Well, as we start to wrap up, I always like to close out with a lightning round, kind of a rapid fire operator guidance of, questions. You ready?
Yeah, sure.
All right. I love it. One metric every supply chain or procurement leader should look at weekly and why.
So from the perspective of like a leverage tool, right, is what percentage of my POs are being processed under leverage? From an e-sourcing tool, it's what percentage of my total spend is under management and what's my rogue spend.
Love that. Okay. One workflow you'd automate next if you had a magic wand.
Three-way match. Our three-way
Mm.
match process is still arduous at best.
Biggest myth in procurement tech right now.
The AI can do everything,
Mm.
right? So I think we already talked about decision making, but the other thing is quick example. I was asking about train passes for my next vacation in Switzerland, and I type it in. I'm going from here to here this many days, and it recommends these two wholeheartedly. Now I've been there before, so I was like, well, what about this other pass? And then it's like, oh, well, yeah, if I'm looking at this, and then it kind of redoes its recommendation. You can't just take everything AI gives you at absolute face value. In fact, is AI better than it was 5 years ago? Absolutely. But you can't just type in a question, it spits out a result and run off with that as absolute truth and gospel, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A practice you wish you'd adopted earlier in your career.
I think thinking about that buyers sitting in the buyer's seat earlier, one of the reasons I think I do a better job at thinking through systems was after we did all these implementations, we had one of our clients called us back and said, hey, we lost this person that was kind of maintaining the e-sourcing and contract system. Can you help us? This was way past go live. Can you help us, with these things? And then I saw how they were actually using it, like, intended path, actual path thing. And I think that helps me go forward envisioning how the system is going to work, how it's going to impact the buyer, how the data was. Early on, I was more worried about getting it in on time, on budget, getting it to work. I took less of the day-to-day life of the end user buyer into account.
I love that. Definitely that, focusing on the user centric design aspect and the empathy around that. The best way to earn adoption from a team that's been burned by systems before.
Put in something small that works,
I like that.
right? Put in some implement something small, but it has to be meaningful, right?
Mhm.
But get that in that works, and then you kind of gain that credibility back.
Trust building, right?
Yeah.
Final question. What would be a single piece of advice you'd give the younger Steve Andrews entering in procurement, supply chain, IT implementations, looking back at your career today?
Make sure that you look at how the system is going to be used a year down the road. How is it going to be able to adapt and grow, and how are the people interacting with it a year from now? And then the second piece is just make sure that at the end of the day, whatever system you put in place, that master data has a way to get back into the ERP system. Even if it's processed offline somewhere, make sure it gets back into ERP so it's not in its own silo and not able for, because that's also how systems get cut, right? So if you put a sourcing tool in and it's in its own island and it never flows back into ERP, somebody in IT is going to go across and look at the landscape and be like, well, I don't know what this thing does. So we're just going to cut funding on it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, Steve, this was extremely insightful and practical. So, first, thank you. For everyone listening, if you want more operator grade conversations like this, subscribe and share this episode with one person on your team who's constantly stuck in exceptions and also thinking through how to implement the best solutions. Steve, thanks again for joining. I'm Andrew Stroup. This is Leverage Supply Chains. See you next time.